Okay, we are in a new book of Torah. We are in Vayikra. And the thing to remember is, even as we're moving from Shemot, or Exodus, to Vayikra, Leviticus, we're not intended to view it as a completely new thing, even though it's easy to do that. If you kind of compared where we came from, we've had two books that are mainly narrative. They're mainly stories. From the beginning, we get this story of creation, and it unfolds from there. It takes us to the Exodus from Egypt. It takes us to Sinai. It takes us through the building of the tabernacle, the golden calf, and all these events which are narrated to us in story. But as we move into Vayikra, which is translated as Leviticus, and I don't like that translation. I just decided today I don't like that translation of Leviticus because it sounds very Latin. And the Bible is not a Latin book. And the more I studied today, and the more I started peeling back the context for the word Vayikra, which the root of it would be kara. And when you see that vav on the beginning of it, then you know it means and, which starts most of our Torah portions, right? So you've got the vav on the beginning of it, and it's Vayikra. And I don't know what type, if you have a Hebrew Bible, or if you have an interlinear text, or what kind of manuscripts you might be working with. And I've actually got a better picture of this, but I'll just hold this up for a second. And I'm not sure if you can actually, if I can get it close enough. But if you look at the first word of the text of Vayikra, do you see how tiny the letter Aleph is on Vayikra, the first word? Which I'm not sure if that's backward on the video camera. I'm probably showing you something completely backward. But I want you to see that the first letter, there's an anomaly there. Instead of having all normal size letters in the text, that last letter of Vayikra is smaller. It's a much more modest size. And I want to investigate how the smaller size of that Aleph relates to what I think we can pull out as an overall theme of the book of Vayikra. And like I said, if we compare it to the last Torah portion, to the last book and the book before it, it does sound like it's kind of sitting right in the middle of the Torah as a bunch of laws, right? Because it's all these technical laws of the sacrifices and purity and priestly laws. And most people read through it as fast as they possibly can because so much of it is not given to us in a story. It's given to us as almost like separate precepts. And then there's a lot of redundancy. I don't know if you've had a chance to read through the whole portion yet, but let's take, for instance, the offering of the sheep and the goats. It's almost identical when you compare how you're supposed to offer sheep versus a goat. But there's one anomaly. There's one thing missing when we read about the goat that was present with the sheep. So a lot of times we do find ourselves wading through a lot of technical details. But if we don't step back for a second and say, wait a minute, why are all these technical details here? And let me compare them to one another to see if I can figure out if there's a message that might be embedded in it. And so that's the difficulty of Vayikra. It's not a story in the way that we've kind of been spoiled to expect up to this point. Because even as he's embedding the rules and regulations at Sinai, because there's so much action, there's so much intrigue, there's so much drama in the story that we can swallow it. It's like, it's okay. We got 10 commandments in here, but look at all the drama that's surrounding it. And we're interested in stories. And we're interested in what's going to happen when Moses comes back down the mountain and they're all having a big time. But resist that temptation to see this as some sort of strange animal standing in the middle of the Torah. Try to see it as a continuation and actually a contemplation of what we've just passed through in terms of the Mishkan. Because if you'll remember, in Pekudei, in our last portion, we're left with the Shekinah, the divine presence, the glory of Adonai in the cloud, in the tent, in the tabernacle. And remember Moses, he's going to have difficulty entering in because the presence is so heavy. It's kavod. Kavod, or glory, means it's like kavod, heavy. So it's hard to penetrate into it. And in that sense, feel yourself like Moses, standing at the entrance there to the tent. You want to go inside because you know that voice is speaking to you from inside the tent, but yet the cloud of the presence is so heavy, you can't go in. Something's holding you back. It's the same thing with the whole nation. The nation knows that they have built this tent so that the glory of Adonai will reside among them. But yet they realize they can't get any closer. Like they said at Sinai, if we get any closer, we'll die. Moses, you go listen. So Moses gets in there closer, but even Moses can't get past the threshold there. And again, if we're going back and we're saying, wait a minute, the principles of resurrection have been embedded in every single Torah portion since Genesis 1. So what I need to understand about Moses right here, as he's about to enter in and to get very technical laws of sacrifice, the whole goal of Vayikra is to teach me how to draw near. Because it's a book of sacrifice. It's a book of the korbanot. I'll type that in there for you. Korbanot. It's sacrifices. It's the sacrifices that help you to draw near to that presence. And that's our ultimate destination. We want to be gathered into the cloud, just as Paul described to us in Thessalonians, where we'll be caught up together with him in the cloud, with them in the cloud to meet the Lord in the air. And so shall we ever be with the Lord, that we will be able to penetrate into that cloud of glory, into that divine presence, like Moses did for specified amounts of time, and then he had to come back out. But then still, Yeshua gives us a glimpse on the Mount of Transfiguration, where the disciples look and all of a sudden there's Moses and Elijah speaking with Yeshua. And that's good news to them. They're like, hey, we want to build Sukkot right here. Why? We want to dwell in the divine presence. But again, it's not time. But when it is time, we want to know those ways of drawing near. We want to know how to bring a proper sacrifice. So even in all the blood and the guts and the fats and the tails and the blood, amidst all that, there are lessons on how we draw near, how we can penetrate into that cloud of the divine presence. So let me start screen sharing. Apparently, I didn't make an active window. Okay, there's that. Here we are. Okay, play from the start. Excellent. All right, here's the readings. Here's the full readings, but you'll notice that I added, 1 Kings 17:7 through verse 24. It's an extra, it's not a prescribed reading, but it's an extra reading that I think is important if you want to tie all the events and the sacrifices of this Torah portion together and see how it's going to relate, which my theme, I went past it, you didn't get a chance to look at it. The theme of the portion I wanted to pull out is the crowns of Israel and the tongues of angels. Because embedded in this Torah portion, like we've seen in Torah portions before, of course, something Yeshua or the apostles wrote about almost casually, like we already knew what they were talking about, but we didn't really know what they were talking about until we went into some rabbinic sources and we understood maybe what a first century Jew would have thought of that particular topic and how he would have related it back to the Torah. So in this particular Torah portion, one of those semi-mysteries of the Gospels and the letters, and especially the revelation of John, is this principle of the crowns, the two crowns of Israel, and the tongues of angels. That was a phrase that Paul used to the Corinthians, where he said, though I speak with the tongues of men and angels. This particular Torah portion gives it context, at least from a rabbinic traditional point of view. And since we know there's so many of those allusions, it makes sense that we go back and we say, okay, how did the rabbis frame in this Torah portion? And what does it have to do with the crowns and the tongues? So that's why I added 1 Kings 17:7 through 24, because it's the story. I isolated right there the story. And again, he's teaching through story, which is much easier for us to absorb. Although sometimes the challenge is, as we're reading the story, we tend to get caught up in the story instead of the theme of the story. And so when we're reading this passage about Elijah and the widow of Sidon, what we're going to get is, again, principles of the Torah portion, which is the meal offering, and how it's going to tie into the message to the assembly of Thyatira in the book of Revelation. There's very specific language, in fact. So I thought that was pretty amazing. But and I just picked 1 Corinthians chapters 12 and 13, because I think Paul in both of those chapters, I think his context is this Torah portion right here. Thematically, it's very close. And when he says a phrase like the tongues of men and angels, we know it has context here. So it pays not just probably to look at those two chapters, but maybe to look at the letter to the Corinthians as a whole, and to maybe wonder if he wrote that letter sometime around this particular Torah portion. That might be something that the more curious would want to take some time and look at. So the starting point of Vayikra, which means and called. And again, it's supposed to be contemplated, even though there's a pause in between Shemot and Vayikra. It's to be contemplated as a continuation of Pekudei, even though it presents us with a pause, because it's a new book. And remember, your biggest spaces in the Torah manuscript are going to be between books. As far as like empty space, we would call it white space. But in between books, that's where you get the most of that empty space or that white space, which should be places for contemplation, so that you can think about what you just read is going to tie into what you are about to read. And so the rabbi's caution is, don't approach Vayikra like it's some separate animal from Shemot. It really is a continuation. It's an extension and a rectification of the problems that cropped up in our story, specifically the sin of the golden calf. In many ways, this is dealing with the sin of the golden calf, because they lost more at Sinai than we typically hear about. From the rabbinic viewpoint, had they followed through with their commitment, we will do and we will hear, they would have been able to regain immortality at that time. They would have once again had access to the tree of life had they not fallen into the sin of the golden calf. That was their moment in history for there to be rectification. And of course, we know they dropped the ball on that one. So you say, well, what does that have to do with anything? As we continue to dig through this and we start to find themes of resurrection, then the idea of what has been lost and what can be regained through the teaching of the sacrifices. So this, what we're about to read in this book of Vayikra, it seems like a bunch of rules and regulations, but it's a teaching. It's in these principles and patterns, it's teaching us once again how to draw close to that presence until the time between the pause. I'm going to show you a pattern of pauses between the calling and the entering in. We've all been called. We're all giving our answers right now with our lives. You answer with your life. Once you're called, you answer. But nevertheless, you're at a threshold that you cannot cross over until either you pass away or the resurrection of the dead occurs. At that moment, you're going to be able to penetrate into that divine cloud, into that glory cloud of the divine presence. So our pattern in that way is similar to Moses. He's modeling for us something that matters. That Moses will receive a call, he'll move forward, and then he'll pause. Just like with the Mishkan in Shemot, the glory falls and it's just too dense at first for him to penetrate. If we back up, we can see the same thing happened at Mount Sinai. We know that Moses is called, but then he has to stop for 6 days. For 6 days, he's on pause, which makes me wonder if I hit the record button. Surely I did. He's on pause for 6 days. But then on the 7th day, he's called on up. He can go on up the mountain. He can penetrate that divine cloud. So folding into all this, what does it mean to be called? When are we called in? How do we enter into the cloud? And which particular day should we be paying attention to as the appointed day to enter into the cloud? Well, according to the pattern we have at this point, as we're moving into Vayikra, it's pretty clear that the 7th day, because that's how Moses went, he was on pause for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, he penetrates into the cloud. And so that's our pattern. That's our practice as prescribed in the Torah. We work for 6 days, and then that work on those 6 days allows us to experience on the 7th day a temporary penetration into the divine presence. And most of you, I think, would agree, if you've been keeping Shabbat for a number of years, that as the weeks and the years move along, more and more you realize that when you take that ultimate pause, that ultimate rest on your Shabbat day, that you realize you are experiencing something that is divine. You realize you're experiencing something that really isn't of this world. You're in the world, but you're really not in the world. You become more and more separated from the world of work outside, and you become more and more gathered into a different mindset than that world out there has. There's more and more distance between you and the world. The world cannot penetrate that cloud, if that makes sense. If if you're not respecting the Shabbat day, it's going to affect your ability to gather into the cloud. Right? It's going to affect the quality, like we saw last week, the quality of that experience when you're gathered into the cloud. So again, it's a two-step process, and we can look at Vayikra 1:1, where it says, and he called Vayikra to Moshe, and God spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, right, two-step process. He called Vayikra, and once Moses responded to the call, then God spoke. And there's a couple of different ways of saying spoke. We can use the word daber, which means to speak, or we could use amar, which means to say. All right, in Hebrew, just like in English, there's different words that we might use to describe speaking, talking. But this seems to be the pattern. First, there's a call, Vayikra, and then what follows is the actual words. The call is not the words he wants to say to you. The call is more like a preliminary invitation. So at this point in our lives, we've all received a preliminary invitation. What does it say? Make your calling and your election sure. Right? Well, how would you do that? Well, you have to recognize, number one, that you've been called and elected. So when you realize you've been called and elected, then you will be mindful of it. It goes back to, remember, putting the kidneys on the altar as an act of mindfulness because it represents the mind. So first he extends the call. And then when you respond to the call, there's a pause. You respond to the call. And then he will speak. You will receive the actual address of the invitation. You'll get the information that he meant to convey to you. At that point, you can enter in and begin to be saturated. Think of it, the word being a cloud. Think of a commandment. Think of your favorite commandment. Think that when you respond, you know there's an invitation to keep that commandment and you're mindful of it. And then you obey that commandment. What are you doing? You're about to be saturated in the cloud of that commandment. You're about to surround yourself with that commandment. And when you saturate yourself in that commandment, then it takes you beyond just the doing. It takes you into the experience of the commandment so that you know it, right? So that you've experienced, you've been intimate with the commandment. It's something you've experienced, not something that's head knowledge. Once you've experienced that commandment, because you obeyed the call to the commandment, now I'm going to do the commandment. And then the third step is you understand it. It doesn't mean you understand everything about it. It means you begin to understand it. Fine. You can only understand it when you've been intimate with it. And by intimate, I mean you've done it. You've had that experience. Right? Let's say you've kept the commandment of Shabbat. Okay, you have experienced the commandment of Shabbat in such a way that you've chosen to saturate yourself and clothe yourself in it by doing it. You knew the call was out there. You knew the invitation to Shabbat was out there. You responded. Okay, there was a pause where you could have said no. Or you could say yes. If you said, I will do, before I hear, before I can fully understand, You say, okay, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to try it. I'm just going to jump in with both feet. I'm going to jump into that cloud. I'm going to let this commandment of Shabbat just envelop me. And once you did that, once you started doing things like rearranging your work schedule, rearranging your worship schedule, rearranging your cooking schedule, rearranging your eating schedule, rearranging your blessing schedule. Once you started to go through the process of those things, you became intimate. Now you're going into denser and denser and denser parts of the cloud. But the irony is your vision is clearer and clearer and clearer. So to the person who can't see Shabbat yet, see, the person who is asking you things like, why do you have to do that? I don't understand why you're doing that. Do we have to do that? See, they're in a different place already. Because they're saying, do we have to? If they had experienced it the way that you have, they would have the same look as you have on your face when they say such things. When you look at them and think, my goodness, do you really think it's that awful? Do you really think it's such a horrible thing to keep Shabbat? Do you really think it's a relationship of do I have to, like telling a 7-year-old to take out the trash? What did Paul say? When I was a child, I did childish things. But when I grew older, I had to do older things. I had to be responsible. I had to be mature. I had to take out the trash because I love a clean house. And so if he extends the call to you to keep a commandment, and he says, like with Vayikra, this book of Vayikra, it's telling you how to get closer. It's telling you how to penetrate this veil. You answer the call, and little by little, week by week, you walk deeper and deeper to the cloud. It gets clearer and clearer to you, and cloudier to the world outside. Because their experience is not like your experience. In fact, they have no experience. What they're asking is for you to explain it to them logically. And you can do that. But if they're only receiving it as information, argument, or logic, they're still not experiencing the commandment. If it's only rational, they're still not experiencing the clarity of the commandment. Because we see Moses apparently has no trouble navigating through the cloud. It's to the outsider, to the one who's not willing to walk into it, who's having trouble seeing. So, 2-step process. Know there's a call, and then listen for what he says. In other words, preparation, and then the receiving of the commandment. And receiving of the commandment means he's pulling you into that cloud so that you can begin to do the commandment. And the more you do, the more you'll understand about why you're doing it. So that's what you do. First, you're called. You contemplate. That's what the pause between the books is about, that white space or that empty space, so that you will contemplate that what you're about to do and studying these commandments of Vayikra is simply an extension of what you just left behind in the accountings of Pekudei. What does that mean? You're contemplating, again, how to approach the Mishkan. That cloud is associated with the presence in the Mishkan. You want to be able to gather in that cloud. Why? Because it represents resurrection to you. Right? If we didn't really get that from the Torah portions, then we get it very specifically from the writings of Paul, who associates being gathered in the cloud with the resurrection. And here's the cloud. Remember, the presence was the sign that he wanted to dwell among the Israelites. And that's exactly what Paul says. So shall we ever be with the Lord. That presence will be there and will be gathered in there. And so on this earth, we have the ability to begin that walk into the cloud. Because when we take that first step in a commandment, or let's say when we take a step away from transgression, we could do one of two things. We could obey a positive commandment, this is what you shall do. Or you could see a transgression and turn your foot the other way and avoid that sin. Either way, it's part of being gathered into the presence, part of being gathered into the cloud. And the glory in Hebrew is kavod, which is related to kaved, which is heavy. You know, in Hebrew, if somebody says, oh, ze kaved, it's like, man, that's a hard thing to do. Or that's really, you know, that's a heavy thing to contemplate. You know, that's not an easy thing. And it's not easy to walk in the commandments because they're glorious. Kavod, or the glory, is synonymous with honor. And trust me, honor is a heavy thing to wear. Because when we're talking about the presence of Adonai, it's something that has to be attained with honor, with good conduct. So what we're going to see in this pattern is that it helps us to understand what Paul is saying and what the rabbis are saying about the tongues of men and angels. And we'll also take a look at some of the, not just John's, but there's other descriptions of the crowns that the righteous wear. That's embedded in this Torah portion as well. And that's why we have to contemplate, say, okay, let's go back to Shemot, let's go back to Sinai, and put ourselves with the whole nation of Israel, standing there at the mountain, waiting to receive the message. They're a saved people. They've already been delivered from Egypt. They've been called. They're step one. And they know they're called because they were told to prepare for 3 days, right? We know 3 is the number of resurrection. Prepare for 3 days. So it's everybody knows there's a call. So now what they have the potential to do, the potential, we know it didn't turn out this way, but the potential is there for them to receive the whole message directly from the one who would save them from Egypt. They were able to receive part of the message. They were able to experience part of step 2. But the whole message they couldn't take, which sounds pretty familiar. People today, I mean, they struggle with the Big 10, much less 613. That's too heavy for them, right? But they're at the threshold. So here's the context when we talk about the tongues of angels. This is coming from the Talmud, Shabbat 88a. And so I'm just going to quote. Rabbi Elazar said, when the Israelites gave precedence to we will do over we will listen or hear, a heavenly voice went forth and exclaimed to them, who revealed to my children this secret, which is employed by the ministering angels, as it is written, bless the eternal God, you angels of his, you mighty in strength, that fulfill his word, that listen to the voice of his word. That's Psalm 103:20. They listen to the voice of his word, First they fulfill, and then they listen. All right. That's the exact backward of what we're used to, because we're rational people. If somebody tells us to do something, our human nature says, why? Right? If you're talking about a toddler, the first thing they say is no. And when that loses shock value, they say why. And if you tell them, they'll say why. And if you tell them, they'll say why. And if you tell them, they'll say why. It's so embedded in human nature to say why. Explain it to me. But if you're a mom or a grandmom or a great-grandmom, you know that when they're in that mode, it doesn't matter how many whys you answer, they're not going to understand it. It's a dialogue game. But it really, the end point of that why game is not resulting in understanding. And so with your children, or at least in the good old days, it didn't matter if you wanted to know why. You simply did it because mom or dad said so. You could figure out why later. But right now, you do what I said. Now, this generation, I think, is a little more geared toward, parental commandments are less absolute. There's not a lot of obedience expected at first command, at least from what I've observed on airplanes. But nevertheless, the biblical pattern is when the Father tells you to do something, you do it, and later you figure out why you did it. Right? And it's not that it's blind. It's not blind faith. It's faith because he's your Father and he's already led you this far. Look at what he did. He took a whole nation out of another nation. He destroyed that first nation with 10 plagues. He gave us manna and water in the wilderness. So at that point, we're not talking about blind faith. He's already established his credentials, so to speak, his position in our lives. He has the credentials. Right now, God has the credentials to tell you to do anything he wants you to do, and you should do it. Because it is written. But because we're human beings, first we want to understand why. What is that old hymn? Farther along, we'll understand why. We need to be singing some of those old hymns, right? Because this was considered the tongues of angels, that they understood the pattern that angels used when they communicated with one another concerning the Holy One. And we'll look at another passage in Isaiah that shows you the pattern. But as far as a proof text, this passage from Psalm 103:20 is the proof text. That first you fulfill, you do the word, and then you listen to the voice of the word. Because if you don't do, then you will never really hear. There's two kinds of hearing. You can hear the sound, but it doesn't mean you're going to understand it. Not at the depth you would had you experienced doing it. So first fulfill, and then listen. That's considered the secret of the angels. Oops. And so they take it back from here. This says, all Israel said at Sinai, Na'aseh, we will do, V'nishma, and we will listen, we will hear. they were employing that angelic pattern of obeying before listening, which means understanding. When we say hear or listen, it means to also comprehend. And in Jewish thought, you really can't separate obeying from hearing, by the way. They're considered two stages of the same thing. How in the world would you obey without hearing, and how would you hear without obeying? They come together. So in Shabbat 88a, it continues. It says, when the Israelites gave precedence to we will do over we will listen, 600,000 ministering angels came and set 2 crowns upon each Israelite. One as a reward for we will do, and the other as a reward for we will listen. So here we have context for 2 traditional Jewish ideas about the crowns and the tongues of angels. And they both go back to the same thing. They're not really 2 different things. It's 2 ways of saying the same thing. When you emphasize doing over understanding, then you're speaking with the tongues of angels, and you're eligible for 2 crowns. You're eligible for the crown of we will do, and we will listen. Listen to what? Deeds of righteousness. And when you do, and when you hear deeds of righteousness, then the Shekinah, again represented by those crowns, rests upon you. It makes you glow with the commandment. Why? Because you accepted the commandments with love. You didn't accept the commandments with, do I have to? Although, and it's really strange, what you find in these Torah portions. In this first offering, I believe, the Olah offering, if you want to bring one of those, you can actually do it even though you really didn't want to. It's okay to be pressured into it, it says. Not that that's the ideal. It's not, they're saying that is not the ideal. But if that's the only way someone will bring in an Olah offering, then that's permissible. And because we know Olah represents resurrection, think of how many people have been scared into heaven because they were more scared of hell. You know how the old-time evangelist is going to dangle you over the fire so you'll go, make a profession of faith? Well, because it's not based on love. It's not as perfect as the person who brings the Olah or the resurrection offering out of love. And so, will salvation still work? Well, if we're putting it in the context of the Olah offering, it could still get you out of hell. I don't know how it affects your experience in the cloud. I don't know that would bring you into those inner parts of the cloud. But at least it's something that goes up, all right? But 2 concepts here that we'll be working with. The tongues of angels saying we will do, and then we will listen, understand. And then the 2 crowns of doing and listening. And so it says, when the Israelites sinned, again, we're going back to Exodus. We're not allowing ourselves to disconnect these laws concerning the sacrifices from what we had just experienced at Sinai. Okay, remember, keep those 2 events together. Don't see Leviticus as a freestanding book that has no relevance to anything around it. It is because of what happened at Sinai that he's having to clarify things for us in the book of Vayikra. So it says, when the Israelites sinned, the children of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments from Horeb, which is Mount Sinai. And again, that same commentary says that it was the angels who actually removed the jewelry, the ornaments. Adi is the Hebrew word for ornaments. And remember, adi, for ornaments, it has the same root of edut, which is testimony. Adat, the assembly. Ad, eternity. So what had they done? They had behaved in such a way as to jeopardize their experience in eternity. They had jeopardized their testimony. Because remember, he said, I'm giving you these laws so that the other nations will look at you and say, what a wise and wonderful God Israel serves. And they're going to be interested in those laws, and they'll be attracted to those laws. I say, there's nothing else on earth like this. But instead, of course, they sinned with the golden calf. And so the commentary says the angels come back, and they removed both crowns from each Israelite. They removed the crown of Naaseh, for doing, and they removed the crown of Nishma, for hearing. And so after that, that's when we realize that they're going to be unable to penetrate that veiled glory of the cloud. Only Moses is going to be able to penetrate that into its inner places and see clearly. And he's only going to be able to do it for measured amounts of time. But one of the commentaries says that the reason Moses' face glowed so much was because the angels took all those crowns that they had removed from each Israelite, the two crowns, and placed them upon Moses. So what was the crown that the people wore? It was the crown of doing and hearing commandments. And when you do, and when you hear commandments out of a pure heart, you glow. There is a glory that rests upon you. We can call it a crown. So without that crown of glory, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, for you to be able to walk into the cloud. Does that make sense? You need a crown in order to be gathered into the cloud. So are we talking about in the book of Vayikra or Exodus, or are we talking about the gathering of the saints at some future Feast of Trumpets? I think the answer again is yes. And we're going to look specifically at those crowns from Scripture to try to get good context. But remember, those two crowns, doing and hearing, when they received those crowns, according to the rabbinic understanding, this was Israel's chance to regain immortality or the tree of life. This was an opportunity to rectify things, to be an example to the nations of this is how we go back to that immortality, to the obedience of the garden. They're poised right there, and at the last hour, they sin, they transgress, they do what they're not supposed to do because they lack understanding. If they understood, if this is true, if they were standing at the edge of immortality and being able to return to the tree of life while still on this earth, had they really understood that, would they have transgressed? Would they have settled for a golden calf that, like with Adam and Eve, now you've got to settle for this physical life. You've got to settle for a fallen life. And to be offered that opportunity to pass into another realm, to go back into that cloud, to be able to enjoy the divine presence, and they gave it up for a calf because they stopped doing and they didn't understand. They didn't discern their time. And we can't throw stones at them too hard, because we do the exact same thing when we know we've been called into the commandments. And because it seems like Yeshua is delaying so long, what has become of Yeshua? Maybe he doesn't really care what I do. When we become lax, as if he's not going to return, which he will, we looked at that last week, there will be accountings, then we also give up something of our future. We give up something in our resurrection. It affects the quality of what our experience will be in the resurrection. And then what we realize is on this earth, we're even having trouble penetrating the glory of the cloud. For instance, on Shabbat, to the degree that you prepare for Shabbat, that is the degree to which you will experience its glory. That's the way it works. Right? You have to do something for 6 days in order to really hear what he's saying on the 7th, and to understand you're really outside of time on Shabbat. You're in a special place. The world can't duplicate where you are. There's only one way to be where you are on Shabbat, and that is to do, to obey, and then to study the Shabbat so that you can better understand and experience it and improve that quality of your experience, because that quality of your experience is carried over into eternity, into immortality. When this mortality puts on immortality, Shabbat goes with you. That divine presence is where you're headed anyway. And he's given you the opportunity to penetrate that veil every single week. It may just be for a measured amount of time, for around 24 hours, but you can experience Shabbat every single week. So when Israel lost these 2 crowns, we can see what an awesome opportunity was missed. Not just for that particular group of people, but generations after. So losing the crown is really losing your grasp of what I do today will affect my resurrection tomorrow, and what happens after that. So that's extended even into the Tefillin, the phylacteries, the prayer phylacteries. You've noticed when Jewish men put on their phylacteries or their Tefillin, first, not second, first they do the shel yad, which means of the hand. And so the box will go on the bicep, aimed toward the heart. They're going to take 7 wraps down their arm and then loop it here through their fingers, because those 3 places are all mentioned in terms of binding the commandments on your arm, on your hand, on your fingers even. So they cover it all in one. Why the hand first? Because it's your action. It says, I will do. You do things with your hands. So you put on the tefillin on your hand first. You say, I will do. And then you put on the shel rosh, which is the box that goes around your head. That goes on second. Why? Because you're making your hearing, your listening, your understanding secondary to your doing. And some commentaries say this is the reason that they're not used on Shabbat, because it's resting in those very commandments and the testimony of what you've done in those preceding 6 days. And that kind of, it's interesting that the 6 days, even though we think of them as work days, they're really pause days. There's an element of contemplation associated with those 6 days. Because if you're not contemplating Shabbat on those 6 days, you will not be prepared for Shabbat on the 7th, if that makes sense. So you do the preparation, you do the doing and the thinking and the understanding and the discerning for 6 days. Because on the 7th, you're going to rest in how well you've done that job, how well you've done the doing and the hearing. Let me check time just a second. Oh, we're almost out of time. Let's see if we got time for Isaiah here. Okay. This is Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 3. I wanted to at least get you this scripture so you can see how is this the tongues of angels. It's based on this passage right here in Isaiah. It says, in the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2, he covered his face, and with 2, he covered his feet, and with 2, he flew. Now watch the words here. If you've got an interlinear or a Tanakh in Hebrew, you can look at it in the Hebrew. It says, and one called out, Vayikra. All right, in Vayikra, you can hear Vayikra. One called out, Vayikra, to another and said, Ve'amar. Okay, you see the pattern there? Vayikra, and then it will either be followed with Daber or Amar. It depends. If you look at your Torah portions, just scan through them, count how many, well, good luck counting. But look at how many times you will see this pattern. First of calling, and then either of speaking, daber, or saying, amar. And so in this context, the angel, it says, calls out, Vayikra, one to another, and said, Ve'amar, holy, 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 kadosh, 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 is the Lord of hosts. He speaks the sacred name of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the Lord of hosts. The whole earth, notice what he says, is full of his glory. Well, glory, there's our word. All right, we've been talking about the glory of the Shekhinah, the glory of the divine presence, the glory of the crowns that would rest on the heads of the Israelites, one glory for doing and one glory for hearing. And we do the same thing in modern English. This is pretty common. We can say, like, hey, listen, 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 listen. Okay, that's the call. When the person is listening, then we say the message. Here's what I want to tell you. Then you deliver the information. So 2 steps. Adding the first step of Vayikra is an endearment. It's kind. It's what a good teacher does. Let's say you're facing a class of 30 second graders, and you know how chatty second graders are. Do you just start saying the lesson to those chatty second graders? Or do you ring a bell to get their attention? You flip the lights on and off to get their attention. You say, class, 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 everybody be quiet. Everybody listen. Everybody look at the whiteboard. All right? You do something to focus and to call them into the lesson. That's not the lesson itself. It simply makes them aware that they're being called to pay attention, to become a part of what happens next, to become part of the science experiment, to be called up to the board to do the sum. So it's 2 steps. The calling, which is an act of mercy, instead of simply beginning to speak, because if you do that, if you just begin to speak, if they're second graders, they're going to miss the first 20 words, and then you're going to have to go back and repeat yourself. Unless you choose not to repeat yourself, in which case they don't have the information they need. So Moses and the Father above are both good teachers. They know that we're distracted. They know that we see squirrels everywhere. They know that we run to and fro and we're busy and distracted with many things. So he reminds us in this Torah portion that just seems so heavy and technical. In this Torah portion, he's reminding us of how much he loves us. He's saying, I know you're distracted. I know you're going to have to feel at times like you're wading through a lot of technical details that even don't apply to you today because there is no temple, there is no Mishkan. But remember, I'm calling you out of love. And the messages in this book are books or messages I've written to you in love. And I love you so much, I want you to pay attention and contemplate what you're about to walk into. I want you to speak with the tongues of angels. I want to put 2 crowns on your head. So he said, listen, I'm calling you. Vayikra. I'm about to deliver a message. And that's where we're poised right now in our reading cycle. He's called us with love and affection. He said, hey, listen, I'm about to tell you something important. I'm about to clue you in about the resurrection and how you can draw near to me and walk into a cloud, and it's perfectly clear to you when people out there can't understand anything you're seeing. And you probably already feel that way. There's days when you're walking in the commandments, it just feels like, why is it so clear to me and my family can't get it? Why is it so clear to me and my old church friends can't get it? Why don't they see the joy in these commandments? Why are they still saying things like, do you have to? Are you telling me I have to? We don't have to. Why are they still using words like that when every commandment is glory? It's joy. It's heavy. He's honoring us. It's kavod, glory. When he gives us a commandment, he's giving the whole earth his glory. It's our opportunity to partake in his glory and to partake in his holiness. Because when we keep a commandment, he's setting us apart. From who? The people who can't see through the cloud. Remember Yeshua telling people, I'm telling parables so they won't understand? We'll go back and look at that one tomorrow because there's actually a context for it in the Tanakh for what he's saying. But there's some people who aren't meant to understand the scripture because they're doing it backward. They're the toddler that's just saying, why. And there is no answer to their why at this stage of their growth and development. Even if it's logical, it's not going to make sense to them until they experience the joy and the glory and the holiness of keeping that commandment. You understand it because in faith, you did it. And now you did it. You did a Shabbat. And you felt the glory. And you felt the heaviness. You felt the holiness. You felt the set apartness. You felt that somehow you couldn't explain it to anybody, but you knew you were really outside of this earth in some way. But yet, people around you didn't understand what you were trying to say. I've had the same experience taking people to Israel. Some people, they know they're home. They know they're in another realm. And some people, it's no different to them as if I took them to Disneyland. Interesting, but no big deal. And it has to do with, do you want to speak with the tongues of angels? Do you want to do it just because he said so? You love him and you know he loves me. He is calling me. He's calling me into the cloud. And if I put a foot in that cloud and I keep a commandment, I keep a Shabbat, then it's going to start clearing up for me. And I'm going to be wondering what other people can't see. when it's so perfectly clear? The tree of life is in here.